Some contracts are written in ink, but the ones that change your life are written in silence. The ballroom stretched wide under a ceiling of crystal chandeliers, each light refracting into 100 quiet glimmers across polished marble, and every guest seated beneath that glow knew they weren't just witnessing a wedding. They were witnessing a transaction dressed in white. Amara Collins stood at the center of it all, her gown tailored to perfection, her posture steady, her face calm in a way that felt practiced rather than peaceful. And across from her stood Ethan Caldwell, the man whose name built skyscrapers and moved markets. His expression composed, distant, like he was signing another acquisition rather than taking a wife. And when the officiant spoke the final words, and the room filled with applause, the cameras flashed, the phones lifted, the deal was sealed without either of them ever once looking like they belonged to the moment. Hours later, the Caldwell estate stood silent against the dark, its glass walls reflecting nothing but the faint shimmer of city lights. Miles away, and inside a bedroom too large to feel warm, Amara stood near the window, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing controlled, as if even the air around her required permission, while Ethan entered with the same measured steps he carried into boardrooms, loosening his cufflinks, setting them aside with quiet precision, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward like the next step had already been decided long before she ever walked down that aisle. The contract lay on the table between them, crisp, untouched, its terms clear without needing to be read again. 12 months, an heir, a legacy secured, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching thin but unbroken, until Ethan reached for his phone instead of the document, his thumb scrolling once before he stopped, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, and when he looked up, it wasn't at her face first, but at the space between them, like he was recalculating something that didn't fit. "There's been an update," he said, his voice low, controlled, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention, and Amara didn't ask what he meant, didn't step forward, didn't retreat. She simply waited, her stillness not passive but deliberate, as if she had already decided that whatever happened next, she would meet it without breaking. Ethan crossed the room slowly, placing the phone beside the contract, the screen still lit with a message from his private physician, clinical, direct, undeniable, and for the first time that night, something shifted in his expression, not shock, not anger, but something heavier, something that pulled him back rather than forward. "You should have told them," he said quietly, though the words didn't carry accusation, only weight. And Amara's gaze lifted to meet his, steady, unflinching, her voice when it came soft but unwavering. "It wasn't part of the agreement to explain myself." And the room seemed to hold that answer in the air, letting it settle between them like something neither of them could ignore. Ethan exhaled slowly, turning away for a brief second, as if the space itself had become too narrow, his hand brushing against the edge of the table before he straightened again. And when he faced her this time, the distance between them felt intentional, chosen. "We're not moving forward with this," he said, each word measured, final, and for the first time, a flicker crossed her face, not fear, not relief, but something quieter, something that looked like the moment before a person decides whether to fall or stand taller. Outside, the city moved on, unaware, indifferent, but inside that room, the terms of the night had already changed, not with force, not with drama, but with a decision that rewrote everything without ever raising its voice. The silence did not break right away. It settled deeper, heavier, as if the room itself understood that something irreversible had just happened, and Amara remained where she stood, her shoulders squared, her chin level, refusing to let the shift in his decision define her, while Ethan moved toward the far side of the room, his pace controlled but no longer automatic, like each step required thought instead of instinct. And when he stopped near the glass wall overlooking the city, he placed both hands in his pockets and stared out at the distant lights that once made every decision feel simple, measurable, profitable. But tonight there was no metric for what he had just chosen, no projection, no forecast, only a quiet certainty that continuing would cost something he was not willing to take. "The arrangement is void," he said finally, his voice carrying across the room without force, and Amara blinked once, slowly, absorbing the words without reacting. because she had learned long before tonight that reacting gave people power they did not deserve. "You can stay here until we restructure the agreement," he added, still not turning to face her. "There will be no expectations placed on you." And the way he said it made the word expectation sound like something heavier than a clause, something closer to a boundary he had drawn for himself. Amara took a breath, steady and quiet, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her dress before she stepped forward just enough for her heels to echo softly against the floor, not approaching him, not retreating, simply shifting into a position where she could be seen if he chose to look. "You are changing the terms after the contract has been signed," she said, her tone even, not challenging, not submissive, just precise. And Ethan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second before turning to face her, his expression composed but no longer distant. "The contract did not account for everything," he replied, and there was a pause, not empty, but full of everything neither of them said, the weight of what had been expected, the reality of what would not happen, and the space in between where neither control nor obligation could exist comfortably. She studied him for a moment, not searching for weakness, not searching for kindness, only measuring truth. And when she spoke again, her voice was softer but no less firm. "Most men in your position would not stop." And Ethan did not deny it, did not pretend otherwise, his jaw tightening slightly as he nodded once. "I am aware," he said, and the honesty of it hung in the air longer than any excuse could have, because it was not an apology, it was an acknowledgement of a line he refused to cross. The clock on the wall ticked faintly, marking seconds that felt longer than they were, and somewhere in the estate a distant door closed, the faint echo reminding them both that the world outside this room still operated on expectations neither of them had yet addressed. And Ethan glanced toward the contract on the table, the document that had defined everything just hours ago, before walking back to it, and placing his hand flat against the surface as if grounding himself in the decision. "This will not leave this room tonight," he said, more to himself than to her. But Amara heard it, and she understood what it meant, not protection from scandal, but protection from distortion, from becoming a story shaped by people who had not been present in the silence that mattered. She nodded once, not in agreement, but in recognition, and then she turned slightly toward the door, her movement calm, deliberate, as if she had already accepted that whatever came next would not be dictated by fear. "Where should I stay?" she asked, and it was the first question she had asked since the ceremony, not because she needed guidance, but because she was choosing to remain present rather than disappear, and Ethan hesitated for the first time, just a fraction, before answering. "There is a guest suite on the east wing. It overlooks the garden," his voice steady again, but quieter now, like the authority behind it had shifted from control to consideration. Amara inclined her head once, a gesture, small but complete, and as she walked past him toward the door, the faint sound of her steps carried something different than before, not resignation, not uncertainty, but a kind of quiet autonomy that had not been part of the agreement they signed. And Ethan remained where he was, watching the space she left behind rather than the woman herself, because for the first time in a long time, the most important thing in the room was not what he had gained, but what he had chosen not to take. Morning arrived without warmth, the kind of pale gray light that filtered through glass walls and touched everything without truly softening it. And in the east wing of the Caldwell estate, Amara stood by the window of the guest suite, her reflection faint against the view of the garden below, where trimmed hedges and still fountains mirrored a life built on order and control, and yet nothing about her presence there felt like it belonged to that design. Not because she did not fit, but because she had not been placed there by choice. She had already changed out of the wedding gown, the fabric now folded neatly across a chair, as if it had been part of a different story entirely. And in its place, she wore something simpler, something that allowed her to move without the weight of expectation pressing against her ribs, and when she exhaled slowly, her breath fogged the glass just enough to blur her own outline. A momentary softness she did not allow to linger before she stepped back and let it fade. Across the estate, Ethan was already awake, seated at the long dining table that could have held a dozen executives, but now held only him, a tablet glowing faintly beneath his hand. Reports scrolling past that he did not fully read, because every line of data, every projected number, felt disconnected from the decision he had made the night before, and when his assistant's name flashed on the screen with an incoming call, he did not hesitate to answer, his voice returning to its usual clarity even if the tone beneath it had shifted. "Yes," he said, and the voice on the other end did not waste time with pleasantries, outlining media interest, investor curiosity, and the early whispers already forming about a wedding that had been too public to remain private for long. Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the surface of the table rather than the skyline beyond, and when the report ended with a question about how to position the narrative, he paused, just briefly, before responding. "There will be no narrative," he said, calm, final. "Nothing is released without my approval." And the line went quiet for a second before acknowledgement came. Because even uncertainty could not override authority when it was delivered like that. When he ended the call, the silence that followed felt different from the night before, less sharp but no less present, and he pushed the tablet aside, leaning back slightly in his chair as if distance from the numbers might bring clarity that proximity had not. But it did not, because clarity had already come to him in a way no report ever had. Simple and unnegotiable. Footsteps approached softly from the far end of the hallway, measured, unhurried. And when Amara entered the dining room, she did not look around to take in the space, did not pause to acknowledge its scale or design. She simply stepped forward until she stood across from him, maintaining the same distance she had chosen the night before, not out of hesitation, but out of control, and Ethan looked up at her then. Really looked, not at her position in his life, not at the role she had been assigned, but at the person standing in front of him, and there was something in that moment that neither of them named, because naming it would have reduced it to something smaller than it was. "You are up early," he said, the words neutral but not empty, and Amara inclined her head slightly. "I prefer to understand a place before it begins to understand me," she replied, and the answer lingered, not as defiance, but as truth, and Ethan found himself nodding once, almost unconsciously, before gesturing lightly toward the chair across from him. "Breakfast will be brought in a few minutes," he said, and she took the seat without hesitation, her movements composed, her posture steady, as if sitting at that table had nothing to do with belonging and everything to do with choice. Neither of them spoke immediately after, the quiet stretching again, but this time it did not feel like something waiting to break. It felt like something being built, slowly, carefully, without pressure. And when the staff entered briefly to set down coffee and a simple plate of food before leaving just as quickly, the moment remained undisturbed, untouched by curiosity or assumption, because within those walls, at least for now, there were no witnesses to reshape what was happening into something easier to explain. Ethan reached for his coffee, pausing before he lifted it, his gaze shifting back to her. "There will be pressure," he said, not as a warning, but as a fact, and Amara met his eyes without hesitation. "There already is," she answered, and in that exchange, something aligned, not agreement, not partnership, but recognition, the kind that did not require history to exist, only presence. And as the morning light grew slightly brighter against the glass, the distance between them remained, but it no longer felt like a divide. It felt like space that neither of them intended to close by force. By mid-morning the estate no longer felt insulated from the outside world, the stillness of glass and marble beginning to carry a different kind of pressure, subtle but persistent, like a shift in air before a storm that had not yet arrived. And in the main office wing, Ethan stood near a floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection faint against the skyline, while voices filtered through the speaker on his desk, board members speaking in measured tones that tried to sound controlled but could not fully hide the urgency beneath. Questions about optics, about continuity, about the expectation that a marriage like his was not personal but structural, a pillar designed to support legacy. And when one of them finally said it plainly, that deviation from the agreement could destabilize more than just perception, Ethan did not interrupt, did not argue. He simply listened until the room on the other end went quiet, waiting for his response. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, even, but carried a finality that did not invite negotiation. "There will be no deviation," he said, and the pause that followed revealed confusion rather than relief, because they had not understood what he meant, not yet. "The structure remains," he he continued. But the terms will be rewritten by me. And before anyone could challenge that, he ended the call, not abruptly, but decisively, as if closing a door that had already been considered closed, across the estate. Amara moved through the garden path just beyond the east wing, the gravel beneath her shoes shifting softly with each step, the air cool enough to carry the faint scent of trimmed hedges and water from the fountain ahead, and she did not rush, did not wander aimlessly. She walked with intention even without a destination, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her gaze steady, taking in the space not as something to admire but something to understand. And when she stopped near the edge of the reflecting pool, she looked down at the surface, her reflection broken slightly by the movement of water, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of what had changed, not the contract, not the arrangement, but the absence of what had been expected of her, a space that could have felt like loss but instead felt like something she had not yet named. The sound of a door opening behind her was quiet but distinct, and she did not turn immediately, not out of disregard, but because she did not react to presence without purpose. And when Ethan approached, his steps slowed as he reached her, stopping at a respectful distance that mirrored the space they had maintained since the night before. "They will push for clarity," he said, his voice low, not carrying across the garden, but reaching her easily. And Amara glanced at him then, her expression composed. "Clarity for them or for you?" she asked, and Ethan exhaled lightly, the corner of his mouth tightening almost imperceptibly. "For control," he answered, and there was no denial in it, no attempt to soften the truth, only recognition of the system he had built and the expectations it carried. She looked back toward the water, her reflection settling again as the surface stilled. "Control requires explanation," she said, her tone thoughtful but not distant. "And explanation requires something to give." And the words did not accuse. They simply laid out the cost of what others would demand, and Ethan stepped slightly closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough to stand beside her rather than behind, his gaze following hers to the reflection below. "I am not offering you as that explanation," he said, and the statement landed with more weight than volume, because it was not a gesture, it was a boundary, one that would hold, whether it was understood or not. Amara was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that considered rather than withdrew, and when she finally turned to face him fully, there was something different in her eyes, not softened, not guarded, but clearer, as if a line had been drawn that she could now see as well. "Then they will look for another reason," she said, and Ethan nodded once, already aware of that outcome. "They can look," he replied, "but they will not find it in you." And for the first time since they had met, the space between them did not feel like something either of them needed to measure. It simply existed, steady, defined not by distance but by the fact that neither of them had tried to take more than what was freely present. And as the fountain behind them continued its quiet rhythm, the estate remained unchanged in appearance, but something within it had shifted, something that no contract had accounted for, and no pressure from the outside would easily undo. By early afternoon, the calm inside the estate began to fracture in ways that were not loud but unmistakable, subtle shifts in movement, in tone, in the way staff members spoke a little more carefully and walked a little more quickly, because news did not need confirmation to begin spreading, and in a world built on power, silence was often interpreted as weakness rather than control. And inside the private office, Ethan stood at his desk reviewing a set of documents that had nothing to do with mergers or acquisitions, but everything to do with containment, statements drafted by legal teams, language polished to redirect attention, each line carefully constructed to offer explanation without revealing truth. And yet none of it felt aligned with the decision he had made. None of it reflected the clarity he had chosen over convenience. The door opened quietly and his chief of staff stepped in, tablet in hand, her expression professional but edged with urgency. "The board is requesting a formal statement by 5 o'clock, she said, her voice steady. "And there are already inquiries from 2 major outlets asking why there has been no appearance since the ceremony." And Ethan did not look up immediately, his gaze still fixed on the page in front of him as if reading something that was no longer there. "They will not receive one," he replied, his tone even, and the words landed without hesitation, without room for reinterpretation, and she paused just long enough to measure whether this was a temporary stance or a fixed decision before nodding once. "Understood," she said, though the weight of that understanding was not light, because it meant stepping outside the system that had always functioned on anticipation and control. Outside, near the garden terrace, Amara stood beneath the shade of a tall oak, the sunlight filtering through its leaves casting soft patterns across the stone beneath her feet, and she held a phone in her hand, the screen dim but still showing the message she had read more than once. A short note from her aunt asking if everything was as it appeared on television, if she was safe, if she was all right, and Amara did not respond right away, not because she did not know what to say, but because she was deciding how much of the truth belonged to anyone outside of herself. And when she finally typed a reply, it was simple, direct, and complete without being revealing. "I am where I chose to be," she wrote, and after sending it, she lowered the phone and let her hand rest at her side, her posture unchanged, her calm not performative but anchored in something deeper than circumstance. The faint sound of voices reached her from the direction of the house, distant but persistent, and she knew without needing to hear the words that the pressure Ethan had spoken of was no longer approaching. It had arrived, and yet she did not move toward it, did not step into the center of something that was not hers to carry, because her presence was not a solution to their expectations, and it would not become one simply because it was convenient. Inside, Ethan finally set the documents aside, pushing them to the edge of the desk. With a quiet finality before reaching for his jacket, his movements deliberate, composed, and when he stepped out into the hallway, the shift in atmosphere was immediate, conversations lowering, attention redirecting, not out of fear but out of awareness, because his presence defined the direction of everything that followed, and as he moved through the space, he did not slow, did not acknowledge the tension directly. He carried through it as if it were already resolved, even when it was not. He found Amara where he expected her to be, not because he had watched her, but because he understood the kind of space she chose, and when he approached, the distance between them felt familiar now, no longer something to calculate, just something that existed with intention. "They want a statement," he said, his voice low but steady, and she looked at him, not surprised, not concerned, just attentive. "And you?" she asked. "What do you want?" And the question did not challenge him. It clarified something he had not yet needed to say out loud, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment. The answer already formed long before the question was asked. "I want the truth to remain intact," he said, and there was no hesitation in it, no strategy behind it, only conviction, and Amara nodded once, slowly, because she understood what that meant, not control, not silence, but protection of something that had not been defined by anyone else yet. And as the light shifted slightly across the garden, the estate stood at the edge of a decision that would shape everything that followed, not through force, not through pressure, but through the quiet refusal to turn a moment of integrity into something easier to explain. The request did not wait until evening. It arrived sooner, sharper, carried not through whispers or internal calls but through a direct message marked urgent, and within minutes the calm structure of the estate shifted again, not outwardly, not in any way visible to someone standing at the gate, but inside, in the way doors opened faster, in the way footsteps overlapped instead of flowed, because control had reached the point where it could no longer remain quiet. Ethan stood in the main hall reading the message on his phone, the glow reflecting faintly against the polished floor beneath him, and for a brief moment he did not move, not because he was uncertain, but because he was recognizing exactly what had been set in motion. The board had scheduled a press appearance without his approval, not a suggestion, not a request, but a statement already circulating to key outlets, a time, a location, an expectation that he would stand before cameras and explain what they could not understand, and in doing so, reshape the narrative into something the market could digest. The phone in his hand remained steady as he read it again, slower this time, not searching for error, but confirming intent, and when he lowered it, the silence around him felt different, less like a pause and more like a line being drawn. Across the garden, Amara sensed the shift before she saw him, not through noise, but through the absence of it, the way the estate seemed to hold its breath, and when she turned, she saw him standing at the edge of the terrace. not moving toward her yet, but already carrying the weight of a decision that would not stay contained. And she did not step forward immediately. She waited, giving him the space to close the distance on his own terms, because she understood now that what mattered between them was not proximity, but choice. When he reached her, he did not soften the message, did not filter it through explanation. "They have scheduled a press conference," he said, his voice even. But the control within it was no longer quiet. It was deliberate, and Amara held his gaze. "Without interruption, without you?" she asked, and he nodded once. "For me," he corrected, and the distinction was not small, because it revealed exactly what had been taken, not his authority, but his voice. The air between them stilled, the fountain behind them continuing its quiet rhythm as if unaware of the shift taking place just a few feet away, and Amara's expression did not change, not outwardly, but something in her posture settled deeper, stronger. "Then they are not asking for clarity," she said. "They are replacing it." And Ethan exhaled slowly, the words aligning with what he had already understood but had not yet spoken aloud. "Yes," he said, and there was no resistance in the admission, only acknowledgement of the system he had built now moving without him. A moment passed, not empty, but full, of the kind of clarity that only comes when there are no easy options left, and Ethan looked out across the garden, his gaze distant but focused, calculating not outcomes, but consequences, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, not louder, not sharper, but anchored. "I will not stand in a room and let them define this," he said, and the statement did not need reinforcement, because it was already complete. Amara watched him for a moment longer, measuring not the words, but the weight behind them, and then she nodded once, slow and certain. "Then do not," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no concern about what that choice would cost, only a quiet alignment with the principle he had chosen to hold. And in that moment, something shifted again, not in the world outside, not in the pressure that continued to build, but in the space between them, where the decision was no longer his alone to carry, not because she would take it from him, but because she would not let it turn into something smaller than it was meant to be. The wind moved lightly through the trees, carrying a faint rustle across the garden, and Ethan turned back toward the house, his steps steady, purposeful, not rushed, because this was not a reaction, it was a response, one that had already been decided the moment he refused to cross a line the night before, and as he walked, the estate seemed to shift with him, not physically, but in the way everything around him began to align with the direction he had chosen, not through force, but through certainty. And behind him, Amara remained where she stood for a moment longer, her gaze following not the man, but the path he was creating, one that no longer followed the structure that had been written for him, but one that was being defined, step by step, by what he refused to become. The press conference was already set in motion by the time Ethan reached his office, the location confirmed as the main headquarters downtown, a glass tower that reflected the city like a mirror designed to show power back to itself. And the invitation had not been subtle, it had been strategic, timed to catch the late afternoon cycle when markets closed and headlines rose. And inside that building, a room was already being prepared with rows of chairs, cameras aligned, microphones tested, a stage built not for truth but for control, and Ethan stood at his desk for only a moment before reaching for his phone, not to cancel, not to delay, but to redirect, because cancellation would have been interpreted as retreat, and delay would have given them more time to shape the narrative without him. His call was brief, precise, and when he ended it, the shift began immediately, not visible from the outside, but unmistakable to those who understood how quickly direction could change when authority was exercised without hesitation. Across the estate, Amara felt the shift not through information but through presence, the quiet tightening of space that comes when a decision has already been made elsewhere. And she moved from the garden back into the house, her steps steady, her expression unchanged, because whatever was unfolding, she had already chosen not to be shaped by it. And when she entered the main hall, she saw him there, jacket on, posture set, not rushed but resolved. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the distance between them holding something that no longer needed to be explained. "They will expect you to follow their plan," she said, her voice calm, not questioning, and Ethan met her gaze directly. "They always do," he replied, and there was no frustration in it, only clarity, and as he adjusted the cuff of his sleeve, the motion was small but deliberate, like everything about him now carried intention rather than habit. "And you will not," she continued, and he shook his head once, not in defiance, but in certainty. "No," he said, and the simplicity of it made it heavier, because it removed all ambiguity, all space for compromise. The car was already waiting outside, its engine low and steady, the driver positioned not as a witness, but as part of the system that moved without question, and as Ethan stepped toward the door, he paused just briefly, not turning fully, but enough to acknowledge her presence without breaking the line he had set for himself. "You do not need to be there," he said, and the words were not protective in the traditional sense. They were respectful, a clear boundary that did not assume her role, and Amara held his gaze, her posture unchanged. "I know," she replied, and then after a brief moment, she added, "But I choose to understand what you are standing in," and the statement did not seek permission. It offered alignment, and Ethan studied her for a second longer before nodding once, a silent acceptance of her choice without trying to define it. The drive into the city was quiet, the distance measured not in miles but in the shift from isolation to exposure, from controlled space to public expectation, and when the car pulled up to the headquarters, the scene outside was already in motion. Cameras positioned along the sidewalk, reporters gathered in clusters, their voices low but ready, because they had been told something was coming, even if they did not yet know what. And as Ethan stepped out of the car, the noise rose slightly, not chaotic, but anticipatory, the kind of sound that builds before a moment is captured and repeated across every screen. Amara followed a step behind, not hidden, not presented, simply present, her composure unchanged as she moved through the same space without reacting to the attention that shifted toward them. And together they entered the building, the glass doors closing behind them with a quiet finality that separated what was outside from what would happen next. Inside the conference room, the lights were already set, bright but cold, illuminating a stage that had been designed for a version of events that no longer existed. And as Ethan stepped forward toward the podium, the room fell into a controlled silence, cameras ready, microphones waiting, every eye fixed on him not as a person, but as a source of explanation. And for a brief second, he stood there without speaking, not hesitating, but allowing the silence to exist fully, to settle, to make space for something that would not follow the script they had prepared. And when he finally looked up, his gaze steady, his posture grounded, the room seemed to shift with him, because what he was about to say would not restore control, it would redefine it. The silence did not belong to the room anymore. It belonged to him. And as Ethan stood at the podium beneath the white glare of overhead lights, every camera in the room leaned forward without moving. Every microphone angled toward a version of the truth that had already been written without his consent. And for a moment longer he let the quiet stretch, not as hesitation, but as control, because the first words spoken would not just answer questions, they would define the frame of everything that followed. His hands rested lightly against the edges of the podium, not gripping, not tense, just present. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried evenly across the room, steady, unforced. "There seems to be a great deal of speculation about my marriage," he said, and the phrasing was deliberate, not defensive, not reactive, but distancing the noise from the reality. And a few heads shifted, pens paused, because this was not the tone they had prepared for. "What you are expecting," he continued, his gaze moving across the room without settling on any one face, "is an explanation that fits a narrative already being built." And there was a subtle shift in the air, a tightening of attention, because he was not stepping into the story, he was stepping outside of it, and that was not part of the plan. Behind him, slightly to the side, Amara stood where the lights softened just enough to keep her visible but not central, her posture calm, her expression composed, not performing, not reacting, simply existing in a space that had not been given to her, but that she occupied without apology. And she did not look at the cameras, she looked at him, not for guidance, but for alignment, because whatever happened next would not redefine her, it would reveal him. Ethan paused briefly, not searching for words, but allowing the room to adjust to the absence of the ones they expected. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not sharpen, but deepened slightly, grounded in something that did not need volume to hold weight. "I will not offer that," he said, and the sentence landed clean, without excess, and for a split second, the room did not respond, because it did not yet understand what had just been removed from it. A hand lifted in the front row, a reporter leaning forward, trying to reclaim control of the exchange. "Are you confirming that the terms of your marriage have changed?" she asked, her tone measured but pointed, and Ethan looked directly at her, not dismissing, not engaging in the way she expected. "I am confirming," he replied, "that my marriage is not a transaction to be explained for public comfort." And the phrasing cut through the room, not as confrontation, but as boundary, and the silence that followed was no longer passive. It was charged, filled with the realization that this was not going to unfold the way it had been scheduled to. Another voice attempted to redirect, asking about succession, about expectations, about whether the absence of certain outcomes would impact the structure of his company. And Ethan did not interrupt. He let the question finish fully. Because control was not in cutting others off, it was in choosing what deserved response. And when he answered, his tone remained consistent, unshaken. "My company is not built on speculation about my personal life," he said, "and it will not be guided by it." And the clarity of that statement shifted the focus again, away from the story they wanted and toward the line he was drawing. Throughout it all, Amara remained still, her presence neither minimized nor amplified, simply undeniable in its steadiness. And as the questions continued, some sharper, some more careful, she did not step forward, did not speak, because her silence was not absence, it was choice, a refusal to be used as context for something that did not belong to her to explain. Ethan glanced toward her once, briefly, not to confirm anything, but to acknowledge the shared understanding that had formed between them without agreement, without negotiation. And then he returned his attention to the room. "There will be no further statement," he said finally, his voice calm but absolute, "because there is nothing here that requires justification." And with that, he stepped back from the podium, not waiting for permission, not allowing space for the room to reshape what had just been said. And as he turned, the cameras followed, not because they had captured what they expected, but because they had witnessed something they could not easily redefine. And beside him, Amara moved with the same quiet certainty, her presence unchanged, her dignity intact, and together they walked out of a narrative that had been built without them, leaving behind a room full of questions that no longer held the power to demand answers. The doors closed behind them with a muted sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have, not because of the noise itself, but because of what had just been left behind. And as Ethan and Amara stepped into the private corridor beyond the conference room, the air felt different, not quieter, not lighter, but clearer, as if something that had been pressing against the edges of the moment had finally been removed without needing to be forced away. Neither of them spoke at first, their steps aligned in a rhythm that did not need to be coordinated, and the polished floor beneath them reflected faint outlines of their movement, two figures walking side by side without touching, without closing the space between them, yet no longer defined by it. Outside, the city continued as it always did, traffic moving, lights shifting, people passing without knowing that something had just changed in a room they would only see in fragments on their screens. And inside the building, the reactions had already begun, phones lighting up, messages sent, interpretations forming, because when control is disrupted, the first instinct is always to rebuild it into something recognizable, something that can be explained. But what Ethan had done did not fit easily into explanation, and that made it harder to contain. When they reached the lobby, the glass walls revealed the gathered crowd outside, cameras still positioned, reporters adjusting their stance, ready to capture whatever came next. And Ethan slowed slightly, not stopping, but allowing the moment to settle again. Because stepping back into that space was not a continuation, it was a new frame, one that no longer belonged to the structure that had been prepared. Amara remained beside him, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, and when the doors opened, the sound rose again, not chaotic, but focused, voices calling out, questions forming before they were even fully spoken. and yet neither of them reacted to it, not with urgency, not with avoidance. They simply moved forward, their pace even, their presence controlled in a way that did not resist the attention but did not feed it either. A question broke through clearly, asking if the marriage was still intact, if the agreement still held, if what had just been said meant something more than it appeared, and Ethan did not stop walking, did not turn to answer, because the answer had already been given in a way that did not require repetition, and beside him, Amara did not lower her gaze, did not shift her expression. She remained exactly as she had been, not diminished, not elevated, simply herself, and that, more than any statement, became the image that followed them. The car door opened, the driver waiting without speaking, and as Ethan stepped aside slightly, giving her the space to enter first, the gesture was small, almost unnoticed by those watching, but it carried something that had not been present the night before, not obligation, not performance, but respect expressed without explanation. And Amara paused for just a fraction of a second before stepping into the car, her movement smooth, unhurried, and when Ethan followed, the door closed behind them, sealing the moment from the outside without erasing it. The drive back was quieter than before, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been decided, and as the city moved past the window in steady lines of light and shadow, Ethan rested his hand lightly against his knee. His posture relaxed in a way that did not come from ease, but from certainty, and after a few moments, he turned his head slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence within the shared space. "They will continue to ask," he said, his voice calm, not warning, and Amara looked ahead, her reflection faint against the glass. "They can ask," she replied, her tone steady. "It does not mean they will be answered." And the simplicity of it settled between them, not as defiance, but as truth. When the estate came back into view, its structure unchanged, its presence as controlled as it had always been, something within it felt different, not visible, not tangible, but real. And as the car came to a stop and the gates closed behind them once more, the world outside continued to move, to speculate, to reshape what it had seen into something it could understand, but inside, within the space, they had chosen not to surrender. There was no need to explain, no need to justify, only the quiet, steady reality of a decision made without compromise, and a presence that remained intact because it had never been offered for anything less than respect.